All right, welcome back to the 626 Productions podcast. I'm TJ. I am joined once again with Pat this week.
Hey, what's up, TJ? Good to be back. Excited to get into it. Talk a little CFP, maybe a little disappointing winners and losers, I guess you could say, of the season, and just kind of look back on the year we just experienced in college football.
Yeah, 100%. This is easily the craziest year since 2007. And, you know, it's not over. We still have all the bowl season. We have the expanded playoff, and we know who's going to be in it finally.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you know, where they fell, we'll discuss if we believe that or not. But nonetheless, we finally got it, and this is a great step forward from the 4-team playoff.
Yeah, I think it should be really interesting this year. And if you've been paying attention, there's been a lot of debate, I guess you could say, over who made the playoff slash who didn't make the playoff. Um, but I think the committee was in a tough position, and we'll get into it more later. But you know, I think there would have been people upset regardless of what choice they wound up making.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you just can't avoid. There's always going to be that team that was just barely left out. I mean, you see it in March Madness every year. They're putting in 68 teams, and there's still 10 teams or so that are like, oh, we should have been in. And I think now you see that a little bit more with college football, because before it was there's one or two teams just missing out on top four. Now it's like, whoa, there's 4 or 5 teams right there in that top 15 area that may or may not be in because of conference championship auto bids, and who you win against, who you lose against. We're still trying to figure out what the committee's going to go about in the future, but this year they've kind of made up their mind.
Yeah, and like you said, there's always going to be those conversations, whether it's a 14 playoff, a 12-team playoff, a 16-team playoff. There's always going to be one fan base or one team that feels like they got the short end of the stick. And considering, I guess we could say, the resumes and the evaluation of those resumes that the committee had to do this year, it was a little bit contentious, but the committee made their decision, and hopefully it sets us up for a good season of bowls and a good matchup in the first round of the CFP.
Yeah, I mean, one way or another, it's much watch TV. We're getting a lot of good matchups, big brands, and then we're getting some, not too regular matchups, or maybe not in the past 40 or so years. And we'll just hop right into those matchups. I mean, first one going top left corner, at least on my graphic. We have Tennessee going to Ohio State. You don't see that almost ever these days.
No, that's a really interesting matchup, I think, especially with Tennessee having to go north, play this game at the shoe. We know that's going to be a really rocking environment. And we kind of touched on Tennessee and Ohio State last week, expressing our concerns slash fears about both of them. So I think this is going to be a game where both teams have the capability to put up a lot of points, but both teams also could just come out and lay an egg. So I don't know if you really can expect a certain outcome or a certain performance here. I think this is definitely the most interesting of all of the first round matchups.
Yeah, and I mean, I think if you're either team, obviously you want to have the home game, but this is probably about as good of a draw as both teams could get. Tennessee and Ohio State, both to me, were a bit disappointing going into the end of the year. So now it's they have this game, which you don't really want to have per se a tune-up game in the playoff, but both teams are trying to find themselves. So if one of the teams can get hot in this game, you never know. You have Oregon in the next round, but if it's an ugly dogfight, or Oregon could be looking pretty nicely into the semifinals.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of one of the issues that we might see people raise as we move forward with this 12-team format, that we're not doing any reseeding as the teams progress, right? So if, let's say, Clemson or SMU win their first round matchups and they're moving forward as a 12 or 11 seed, they would not play that top seeded Oregon. Oregon is locked in to play the winner of Ohio State, Tennessee, regardless. So I don't know if you're an Oregon fan, maybe you're a little bit upset about that or feel like you kind of got, I won't say the most difficult path, but definitely a hard matchup in that second round, despite the fact that it's at a neutral site. So we'll have to see kind of what that bears this year and moving forward with the 12 team.
100%. Moving on to that bottom left matchup, you have Clemson traveling to Texas. Texas had a great chance to win the SEC in their first year. Ultimately, I think it came down to Georgia's been there a bunch lately. They know how to win that game. You have Gunnar Stockton coming in second half, just really putting everything on the line for Georgia. Very low scoring affair. No points really until the end of that game. But you know, Texas is still a very good team. Their only two losses this season are to the same Georgia team, who obviously is the number 2 seed now. Excuse me, excuse me. How do you view Clemson going into Austin in that matchup?
I think this is, I don't want to say the most confusing matchup because I definitely think that's Ohio State, Tennessee, with how inconsistent both of those teams have looked. But I'm not really sure we know what this Texas team is, I guess you could say. Yes, they had that big win over Texas A&M in the Lone Star Showdown at Kyle Field, but after Texas A&M dropped out of the top 25 for the college football playoff, this is now a team that's 0-2 against the top 25. And granted, yes, the committee can kind of cook the books there a little bit, and they're the ones who determine your record against the top 25. SMU could theoretically have 2 extra wins against the top 25 if Louisville or Duke were ranked, but they're not. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what Texas has. Their defenses looked a lot better the past few weeks. They looked great against Texas A&M. Yes, they lost to Georgia last night in the SEC championship, but I thought their defense played their butts off. They forced Stockton into that really poor throw that almost turned the tides in the Longhorns' favor there at the end, but just wasn't really enough to get them over the hump in regulation. And then obviously they lost in overtime. And then you got Clemson, who is a 3-loss team, the only team in the playoff with more than 2 losses. They got beaten by South Carolina in the last game of the regular season, but then they bounced back really strongly against SMU. Had a great first quarter and then kind of hung on for dear life the rest of that ACC championship. So I think it'll be a good game. I think it'll be a close game, but I really have no idea what to expect out of that one. I'm not sure what you're thinking about it either.
I like Texas there. They've, like you said, they only have two quote unquote top 25 win or matchups rather, and both are losses. But throughout the entire season, Texas has still had some tougher matchups, and they've looked very good in them. Clemson not very tested throughout the season, and all of their tests that they had were you know were losses. The ACC championship game was their first you know playoff. Playoff was on the line for them. They had to win that game. They
Yeah.
got it, but that second half, you could see SMU was coming back, and you know if they scored that touchdown with 8 seconds left less on the clock, that game's going to overtime. I
Yep.
don't think Clemson wins that game in overtime, but nonetheless, they still got it done. They held on, but I just don't think that they would be able to go on the road to Austin and win a playoff matchup.
Yeah, and that's a tough environment to play in. I think I tend to agree with you. I would pick Texas to win that game too. But I think it's going to be interesting to see how Sark kind of gets the boys fired up a little bit again. Who knows? Maybe they'll even see Georgia down the line for a third time in the national championship if the chips kind of fall that way. But I think that'll be a good game between Texas and Clemson. But I'd lean with you. I think the Longhorns are going to pull that one out.
And something I do want to bring up, you touched very briefly on the SEC championship game. Texas's defense looked very good. That was a good old fashioned SEC championship game, especially in the first three quarters. Um, if Carson Beck did not get injured before that half, I don't know if Georgia would have won that game. He did not look very good. He would have had two or three extra interceptions if Texas's defensive line was not continuously jumping off sides. Um, you know, how that would have played off in actuality in the second half, we'll never know. But that was just, something that did, jump out to me was, Texas defense was getting turnovers, but everything got negated because of penalties. So
Yeah, yeah.
just a hypothetical, of course, at this point. Moving up to the top right corner now, we have Indiana taking on Notre Dame. An interesting in-state matchup that you never really see. 10 seed Indiana. What a great story that team is, first of all, this
Oh
year.
yeah. Coach
Coach,
Sig's done a great job.
just incredible. Coming over from James Madison last year. And I mean, you could almost say is, James Madison, but wearing red this year. He had a lot of transfers follow him. But the fact that he was able to recruit that at James Madison, have so many of them come with him to a Big Ten school and do what they've done this year, I think says a lot about him as a coach, recruiting, game planning. Just impressive over there. One loss at Ohio State. Didn't look the best there, but they got the job done everywhere else.
Yeah, yeah. Like you said, Coach Sig's definitely done a fantastic job. I think pretty much every media outlet I've seen thinks he's going to win Coach of the Year this year, and deservedly so. You never really hear about Indiana football in these types of conversations, and he's made them relevant in a really strong, really competitive Big Ten. Just look at last year's national champion, Michigan. Granted, Michigan might have had a slightly harder schedule this year, but they go 7-5 in the Big Ten, while Indiana goes 11-1. With, like you said, a lot of those guys transferring over from James Madison, and proving, you don't necessarily need a whole bunch of 5 stars and 4 stars to find that level of success. You just need the right guys and the right coach.
Absolutely. And then, on the flip side, they are going to South Bend to play Notre Dame. This is a Notre Dame team that I was not high on at the start of the year. They had a win against Texas A&M, who I was never very high on. But they had a decent start to the season. They eventually fell off to about where I expected them to be toward the end of the season. That was their big win. Next week, they come home, Northern Illinois, they lose. And it's like, oh, okay, well, Notre Dame, I guess, might not have it either. Well, outside of that weekend, they've played great football.
Yeah,
Uh,
no,
just a complete head scratcher against the Huskies. But, since then, they've made up for it. And I would almost say, and then some.
yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. Especially if you look at the way that they just physically dominated Army in that matchup at Yankee Stadium. And then Army went out on Friday night, and shout out to them. Awesome story this year. 11-1 headed into the Army Navy game, winning the American Conference. It's a huge deal for them as a program to, reach that level of success. But if you go back, I guess it would have been 2 or 3 weeks ago, they just got completely dominated by Notre Dame's defense. And I think that's the biggest difference this year between Notre Dame under Brian Kelly, or, the past few times we've heard their name pop up in these types of conversations, and this season's team. It's a much more physical defensive line. They're more athletic at the linebacker position, and they've had some injuries to their secondary, but it's still a pretty deep secondary. Xavier Watts is a fantastic player. He had that 100-yard pick six against USC last weekend. And I don't know, I really like the way this Notre Dame team has come together after that I guess you really can't call it anything but baffling loss to Northern Illinois.
Yeah, I mean it was very clear that they had a quick redirect after that game because, I mean, after that game, there was really no signs of that Notre Dame team at any point in the season after that. So I mean, big shout out to them. They really got the ship right in a hurry, and they look very good. You could almost argue that that 7 seed is not where they properly belong. But of course, they're not in a conference, so they're not eligible for that bye week. Will this push them toward going to fully join the ACC? Who knows? College football is a crazy world these days, so there's no commitment to the tradition anymore.
Yeah. And I don't know, who knows? Maybe if we're considering regionality a little bit, I know that idea is pretty much dead here in 2024, but maybe they decide to give the Big Ten a call, see if they can join the Big Ten and become pretty much a super conference with them joining the likes of Ohio State, Penn State, Oregon, USC, so on and so forth.
Hey, or even crazier, Pac-7 come calling. Pac-7 and a half, count Gonzaga. Notre Dame runs that conference. You never know.
Never
Never
know.
know.
Never know.
Um, and one thing I want to lightly touch on, we talk about Army. They lose that game to Notre Dame. Notre Dame looked amazing in that game. Army's only loss of the season. There was a little bit in the second quarter where they looked pretty good there. They had a blocked kick, scored a touchdown. That's basically where all their points came from, was that, little 5-minute exchange in the second quarter. Um, but, you know, were we too harsh on Army? I mean, they were right there as a fringe playoff team. They lose that game to what appears to be one of the top 4 teams in the country. And now
Hmm.
they're nowhere in sight. They get an upset win against Tulane in the American Conference Championship. Did we pull them back just far enough to open the door for the ACC so we didn't have that controversy? Uh, because, Clemson and Army were neck and neck there up until that
Yeah.
game. Were we a little too harsh on Army for that loss? I mean, like you said, Clemson has 3 losses going into the playoff now. Army would have, presumably, they're going to beat Navy most likely,
Yeah.
and they're 12-1, only lost to being another playoff team. So, you know, raises some slight question marks.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think Army is an underrated team. I guess as underrated as a top 25 team could be. Um, I think their biggest question is just how would they meet, the physical nature of a top tier opponent. I think that's really what held them back. If they only lose to Notre Dame instead of it being, 49-14, maybe it's a two-score game or 17-point game, something like that. Uh, Maybe it's a different question, but I think the way that they lost is really what hurt them in the eyes of the playoff committee.
100%. And I mean, looking at the bracket, it would be very weird to see Army going against Texas, in that spot instead of Clemson. However, on the flip side, it was early in the season, but Clemson has a 35-3 loss against another
Hmm.
playoff team.
Hmm.
Not to mention a loss to a fringe team, and then they also who is Clemson's other loss?
Louisville. I lost to
Louisville.
Louisville. Yeah.
So unranked team, playoff fringe team, and playoff team. Louisville and South Carolina games were obviously very close, but the number 2 team in the country now, that game wasn't close. So you can make an argument either way. Committee obviously did not feel like making that argument, so they put Army way back there. Uh, but college football's crazy. I mean, we'll have to see where it goes from here. But I mean, if Army has another good season like they did this year, next year, um, you never know. Black Knights could be dancing in the playoff.
Yeah, yeah. Or maybe if we see a scenario where the American kind of ate itself a little bit outside of Army, if you see a team like Memphis or Tulane sneak into that championship game with maybe one loss instead of two losses, I think it's a different story. I remember before Tulane lost to Memphis, the big talk was if Tulane wins out and wins the American, is the Big 12 in trouble? That was before Arizona State kind of became America's sweetheart a little bit. Um, and people are asking questions because Tulane was ranked higher than Iowa State at the time. They were right there with BYU. They were right there with Colorado. And who knows? Maybe it's partially to do with the logo. People don't traditionally associate Army football with success in the modern era. Maybe if that was Memphis, Tulane, um, shoot, South Florida, even that was 11-1 with a conference championship. Maybe it's a different story and Clemson doesn't have a shot. But like we said last week, we can't play the game of hypotheticals too much. Clemson did win the ACC, and the committee deemed them worthy enough of that last spot in the playoff.
100%, 100%. The American Conference is in a very weird position because up until this past season, you had teams like Houston, UCF, Cincinnati, teams like that bolstering up the top. And Tulane was stepping up there at the end. Memphis has traditionally speaking been a pretty solid team in that conference. But then you fill the gap with teams that have been struggling in other conferences like Conference USA, where you now bring in Rice, Charlotte. So then now that top has to be 1, 2 losses maximum
Mm-hmm.
to even be considered to be ranked. Because if any of those losses come to those Charlottes, that's very bad on their resume.
Yeah,
Um, because I think the conference resume matters in
definitely.
2024.
Definitely.
Now, does the non-conference matter? We will talk about that later. That's a whole nother can of worms. So let's go into our final first round matchup. That is going to be SMU at Penn State. Again, a very interesting matchup. SMU, thankfully, I think in my book, the committee got this one right. They still deserve to be in the playoff. Um, but now they have a tough test going up to Beaver Stadium. I saw it was a whiteout. I'm guessing it's going to be a night game. So
Yeah.
could be very tough for the boys from Texas.
Yeah, no, that's gonna be a really interesting matchup. We saw SMU start a little bit slow yesterday against Clemson in Charlotte. Temps were low in Charlotte. I think it was kind of high 30s at kickoff. Maybe that had something to do with it. Those guys are from Texas. Sure, it gets a little cold, but not middle of nowhere Pennsylvania cold. So I think it'll be interesting to see how they handle the weather first and foremost, but I think this is going to be a game with a lot of points. Penn State has a pretty good defense, but we saw last night against Oregon. I mean, Oregon put up 45 points on them. They can give up points, and they're prone to giving up explosive plays, which is what this SMU offense, that air raid style under Rhett Lashley, is kind of predicated upon. So I think it'll be a really, really close game. I think a lot of people are writing off SMU just because they lost in the conference championship, which I think is a pretty foolish thing to do. I agree with you that the committee got it right choosing SMU over Alabama because of the precedent that would have set regarding championship games and kind of putting us towards that path that Lane Kiffin was hypothetically speaking about earlier in the season.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It creates a bad point because I mean SMU where they were sitting at previously, you know, hypothetically speaking, they don't play the ACC championship game. I guess they maybe they just crown Clemson or Clemson plays Miami at that point. I don't know.
Mm,
But I mean, SMU sitting in a hosting spot. And it's like, okay, yeah, if they win the ACC, they get a bye week.
yeah.
Awesome. If they lose the ACC championship game and, you know, they get kicked out of the playoff, it's like, wow, we just went from not doing anything, hosting a game, to then, we could either be on a bye week or completely out of the whole thing. So then it's like, okay, yeah, there's a risk reward like to get the bye week, yeah, but at the cost of being one of the top teams in the country and then missing out on the playoff. It just would
Hmm.
not have been right.
Yeah, and I think one thing that people kind of tend to overlook a little bit when talking about the future of conference championship games and things of that nature, you got to remember how much money these things make for the conferences themselves. Especially the SEC championship game. That thing generates so much revenue for the SEC that commissioners are probably never going to go and move away from a conference championship. Um, and I don't think we should devalue those games. I think it should mean something to be a conference champion. But I also don't think that we should see a scenario where, let's go with Boise State. You go 11-1. Your only loss is to the number one team in the country during the regular season. If they had hypothetically lost to UNLV, they probably, I won't say definitely, but probably would have dropped out of the playoff. And I think that's a little bit wrong. Yes, UNLV might not be viewed on the national level at the same level as an Ole Miss or Alabama or Miami or South Carolina, those fringe playoff teams. But UNLV is a really good team this year, especially for a G5 team. And to have hypothetically, taken Boise out of the playoff if they had lost the game, which they did not, I think would have been a really, really dangerous precedent to set, and a message from the committee regarding the importance of not just, I guess, winning your games, but also making sure you don't lose what is technically a postseason game in the conference championship.
Yeah, and I mean Mountain West Championship game. Obviously, that's not one of the Power Fours, and like it kind of feels like we have kind of bridged a little bit of the gap. Like, yes, you still have your power conferences. Yes, you still have your group conferences, but it feels a bit more like okay, it's even playing field now. Like if you're a good team, you're in. Like it's not like if you're a Group of Five champion, yeah, you're the number 12 seed. Like you're seeing uh, a two-time national champion in the last 10 years in Clemson. They're the 12 seed. They're the one that got put in because of the automatic bid.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but you go from that where it's like we're feeling a little bit more bridged, a little bit more together, and then the team that has been top 10 the whole season, they are you know probably going to get the bye week. They lose that conference championship game, and then they're out of the whole thing.
Yeah.
So then it would then send a clear message of if you're a Group of Five team, we don't care how good you were the whole season, you have to win your conference championship, which I think that's a bit too much.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I think that's the wrong message. And I'm glad we didn't have to see how the committee would handle that. But hopefully they would, I don't know, handle it the proper way, let's say, and give that G5 team its credit and its flowers. Granted, they probably wouldn't be getting a bye or hosting a game, but at least put them in the playoff so they can show their worth.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So let's hop into the top four seeds, and I'll start this with a question: of the top four seeds right now, who would you least like to play?
Ooh. That's a tough question. I think the easy answer is probably Oregon because they're the number one team in the country. They've been the number one team in the country since Georgia beat Texas the first time. They've looked really good all season. They've played a quality schedule with the Big Ten this year. Yes, both the Ohio State games and the Penn State game last night were pretty close, but they've beaten everybody they've played. They've looked really confident offensively. Their defense is a work in progress, so that could get exploited against a really explosive team. But I think Oregon's the team you want to avoid right now. Arizona State is playing really good football. I wouldn't love playing against them as an opponent, but I think Arizona State has an easier formula to stop in the sense that if you limit that run game and limit what Cam Scatterbo is doing, not saying that that's an easy thing to do, you can kind of hamper their offense a little bit. Boise State's structured the same way. Like we talked about last week, if you throw, let's say, 7 or 8 in the box and force Maddox Madsen to beat you, he did it this week. I'll give him credit against UNLV, but is he going to be able to do that consistently? And then I think Georgia is a really good team. When is Georgia not a really good team the past few years here? but how serious is the Carson Beck injury? Stockton looked really good yesterday coming in during the SEC championship, but part of that could be the fact that there's not a whole lot of film out there on him. Defenses don't really know his tendencies. And now that we have a little bit of film to go off of, defenses can kind of scout and game plan if he is going to be the starter and possibly limit him a little bit more than Texas was able to yesterday.
100%. Yeah, I like your thinking there. I mean, Oregon has proved they're the number one team in the country, the only team going into this playoff undefeated. But I mean, I think Arizona State is the scary one. They have a lot of momentum on their side right now. They're playing really good football at the best time of the season. So I mean, outside of Oregon, which those two would meet in the semifinal, assuming that everything goes based on seeding.
Yeah.
Um, you know, that would be a great matchup. Those are two teams that are playing great football right now. Going to the other side, not that Georgia and Boise State aren't playing good football either, but yeah, Georgia's been a little bit inconsistent this season. What is that Carson Beck injury? You get Carson Beck, he hasn't been Carson Beck from last year.
No.
So what are you getting from him back, even if he's 100% or not? Are you getting last season Carson Beck? Are you getting the one that is leading Georgia to great wins, looking almost indestructible? Or are you getting Carson Beck who is throwing like completely errant passes, lots of bad time interceptions?
Hmm.
What are you going to get from that team? And then Boise State, great team. They've made it this far. Only loss being to Oregon on the road. But if a team can stop Genty, which is easier said than done this season, we've seen firsthand many times. Um, if they can stop Genty, Boise State's going to have a hard time scoring points. I mean, if you keep Genty under 100 yards, your magic number is probably sitting at 21 because I don't see Boise throwing for more than 2 touchdowns. I
Yeah.
just can't see that with the defenses in the playoff. So should be interesting to see. We'll go a little bit more in depth on the matchups next weekend with our full bowl preview. But Pat, let's move into one of the most entertaining parts of the off season and postseason is the coaching carousel, and we've already seen it in full swing.
Yeah. It's already been a pretty, I guess, hot start to coaches moving around. We have two coaches who are actually conference champions this year that are moving on to new jobs already. One was literally announced, I think, 30 minutes after he won his conference championship, and the other was announced this morning. So a lot of change in mostly G5 at this stage, but some power schools have either moved on for their head coach and found a replacement or are currently looking. So we'll start with one of those power schools in UCF. So Gus Malzahn, as most of you probably know by this point, resigned the UCF head coaching position to become the OC over at Florida State. Kind of a confusing move. I don't follow UCF as closely as I know you do, TJ, but they've had back-to-back losing seasons if you count losing in the bowl game last year, so maybe that had something to do with it. But UCF kind of making a little bit of a splash, playing on nostalgia a little bit as well, bringing back Scott Frost to be their head coach, which I think is an interesting call. If I had to like throw a grade on this, I'd probably give it like a solid B plus. The only reason I wouldn't give it an A is just because of how poorly it went at Nebraska after he left UCF the first time. But this is a guy who's a proven winner at your program. He knows the area, he knows how to recruit the area. He's going to get fans excited. So you're probably going to get a boost in NIL. And I think it's an overall really strong hire for them.
I mean, he completely changed that program from where it was. George O'Leary was there for about 20 seasons or so. He inherited a winless team, and he went out on a winless team. So there was a lot Scott Frost had to do coming over from the OC of Oregon, and he did it very quickly. He winless team when he came in. He took him to a bowl game that first season. I believe they ended up losing that one, and then the very next year is when they beat Auburn in the Peach Bowl.
Mm-hmm.
So he turned it around very quickly. UCF has had the identity of like fast offense, very quick tempo, and he put all that in. It started with Frost, it went to Heupel, went to Malzahn. UCF probably has seen his best recruiting under Malzahn, but of course Malzahn has not been able to do it on the field. So what's
Yeah.
Frost going to be able to do now that he's back with the weapons that Malzahn has brought in? You look at the Nebraska job, and I don't know how much of it is Frost and how much of it is Nebraska, because it's crazy to think this, but in the past couple decades, one of Nebraska's best coaches was Bo Pelini,
Yeah.
of all people. And he was just a very unlikable guy, but he won on the field. And as soon as they moved away from Pelini, it
It's
went
been
downhill
bad.
very quickly. It didn't matter who the coach was. If college football was all about keeping it a one score game, Nebraska would be the national champion probably 7 out of the last 10 years. But that doesn't win ball games, and yeah, like you could have the best 3-9 team with field goal losses in all of them, but you know that's not getting you to bowl game. That's not making you money, and that's not winning championships. And ultimately, that's basically Nebraska football, even under Matt Rule now.
Yeah.
So we'll see what Frost has in the second go around at UCF. Certainly, locally, very exciting, but on the national stage, could leave some question marks.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really solid analysis of not just where UCF is at, but I guess you could say what's on the line a little bit here for Scott Frost, proving that it wasn't a fluke the first time he found that success at UCF. And I think one of the things that people kind of forget about UCF when they were really, really strong as a program, both under Frost and Josh Heupel before he went to Tennessee, is that they had really good running backs. And I think the talent at running back has slipped a little bit under Malzahn. Maybe that's the reason they're struggling a little bit more. I don't know. But I think it'll be interesting to see what Frost can do, see if he can turn things around immediately like he did his first time. I think he's on a 5-year contract. So he does have a little bit of time here. And I think the fans and the boosters will be behind him.
I think you'll see a lot of money come in on the nostalgia basis for sure, and then it's just going to be a matter of after year one, year two, where Frost goes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, One thing that Frost in this position, obviously he went back to his alma mater. It was going to be going from a group school to a power program.
Yeah.
Now UCF is in the Big 12, so that's not necessarily there. So unless one of the big boys came calling with more money, if Frost is able to succeed at UCF, I could see him staying there for a long time. He almost did not take the Nebraska job
Mm.
uh, due to how much he enjoyed at UCF. So, you know, obviously that's going to be years down the road. We'll have to see. And to touch on the running backs, I think RJ Harvey, great running back. I just don't think Gus Malzahn knew how to slash put a little bit too much investment into
Mm.
KJ Jefferson
Yeah,
from
definitely.
Arkansas. Jefferson ended up getting benched about halfway through the season. And they were kind of counting on him. And it's once your offense goes one dimensional, it doesn't matter how good your running back is, unless his name is Ashton Genty, apparently. Um, you're going to get stopped.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there. Harvey is a really solid back, but maybe they were putting a little too much on his plate. Speaking of programs that might have put too much on, we'll say their offenses or maybe their head coaches in general's plate. We'll move to another P4 of school that moved on from their head coach and has found a replacement in Purdue. It was announced today, right in the midst of all the bowl games being announced, that Purdue is going to be hiring Barry Odom from UNLV. So I think that's an interesting hire.
I like that hire. That's a good
Yeah,
hire.
yeah. I mean, he's a guy who has coached in that, we'll say, general region before. He was the head coach at Missouri, ran into a little bit of difficulty there near the end of his tenure. Um, but I think he took that as a learning experience, and he's built UNLV into a really solid G5, as we've already talked about today. Um, I think it'll be interesting to see what he can do at Purdue, especially now that you are probably program number 3 in the state. All right, Notre Dame's still the top dog, but now you have Indiana finding success under Coach Signetti. And how is that going to impact them in terms of recruiting, in terms of getting fans to go to the game? I know Purdue's always had a strong support from their fan base, but a 1-11 season can kind of put a damper on things like that.
Yeah, I mean that's actually you saying that right then is the first time I have heard of that. And in the short reaction to it, that I think that's a great hire. I think Barry Odom could bring in that hard nosed defensive style that would be kind of new um, to that area in a sense, and probably be good to combat the other types of programs in that vicinity, and make Purdue. They won't be great by any means to start off with, at least, but could make them a bit of a pester to see on the schedule and not make it what they were this season.
Yeah, and I think it's important to everybody wants to win immediately in this NIL era. Um, but that's not always going to be possible. So I think Purdue fans have got to have a little bit of patience, let Barry Odom kind of settle into the job. Year one, you might not make a bowl. But if you're seeing progress and if you're seeing movement towards better results and a better program overall, I think you got to be happy. I mean, there's not really many places you can go but up after a season like they had under Ryan Walters, and it's not like last year was a whole lot better at 4-8. So you want to talk a little Sun Belt, or you want to talk American next in terms of head coaches?
Let's head down to the Fun Belt.
All right, little Fun Belt action. So we'll do Southern Miss because that was announced more recently. That got announced right around, I'd say 2:15, 2:30 today. They had fired Will Hall midseason, so we knew this was going to be an opening. They haven't had a winning season since I want to say 2022, and that was Hall's only winning season as head coach. So this is definitely like a historically relevant program, particularly in what used to be their affiliation with Conference USA, but now the Sun Belt. Um, that general region and that group of G5 teams that they're going to compete against in recruiting battles. But they decided to hire Charles Huff, a head coach over at Marshall, or the former head coach over at Marshall, who just led Marshall to a 10-3 season, counting their win last night over Louisiana in the conference championship. So I think that's a great hire. A little bit surprised that Marshall let it get to this point. Huff's been on his last year of his contract all season. We kind of knew that there was some tension between him and the athletic department, but I still thought they would kind of figure something out, and not let him go laterally in conference to a team like Southern Miss.
Yeah. Once again, I guess I am not up on the head coaching train, but the that is first time I'm hearing that as well. That is very shocking for a program like Marshall as well. Historically, very relevant. Coming off of a conference championship winning season, and yeah, that is very very surprising. I mean, also good on Southern Miss, shows that they are very serious about getting guys that can win and win now. Um, so I mean, he knows the conference,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm sure Huff already is recruiting similar areas that Southern Miss is looking at. I think that's probably as close to an A as I've seen yet so far.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great hire by Southern Miss, and I think this is an opportunity to get like we've talked about, historically pretty good program. If you go back to their Conference USA days, back on track. The past decade or so has been a little bit rough. It's been a lot of up and down for the program. You had the whole Brett Favre scandal with the university in general. So hopefully, this is some positive news that can get Southern Miss football trending back in the right direction. So staying in the Fun Belt, we'll go to App State. So App State fired Sean Clark after the season concluded, and in what I think is a pretty shocking move. I definitely did not see this coming. They've decided to hire South Carolina's offensive coordinator, Dowell Loggins, to be their next head coach. I think this is probably the most confusing hire that we've seen so far, from, we'll say, like, relatively bigger name programs. Yes, you've had some smaller G5 schools hire FCS coaches, but all of those coaches have had success at the FCS level and been head coaches before. So to see a program like App, that's been a really relevant G5 team the past 6 or 7 years, go for somebody who isn't exactly young and doesn't have any head coaching experience under their belt is a little bit surprising, in my opinion.
Yeah, this is, kind of. I feel like App State's moving further and further away from what made their brand so recognizable nationally. I mean, you had big offensive masterminds between like Drinkwitz. Oh man, I just lost every name. But I mean, that similar style of, it's a young guy, brand
Hmm.
new offensive ideas. They're moving fast, they're moving flashy. Clark, not really of the same thread in that regard, but not incredibly far off either. And now you're moving to a very pro style, slower offensive like scheme with you know Loggins is a great, I think, coach of quarterbacks.
Hmm.
I don't know if he's a great game manager when it comes to play calling and things of that nature. He was at Arkansas before. Arkansas hadn't really had great uh, offenses. Then he goes to South Carolina. He has 2 years with Spencer Rattler, and then this past season with Lenore Sellers. But you know, if you look at that Clemson game, South Carolina didn't have a lot going on offense, and I mean there was what 3 or 4 plays where Lenore Sellers was about to get sacked, and then
Yeah.
just somehow escaped, and he ran for 30 yards, and that was a lot of South Carolina's yardage on plays like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things that confuses me the most about this hire, um, is kind of the fact that a lot of South Carolina fans wanted Dowell Loggins fired last year after his work with Spencer Rattler. There was a really disappointing season in Columbia, going 5-7, seeing the offense kind of take a step back, which is crazy to say given what was going on with Satterfield. Um, but then he kind of turns it around, helps Sellers along this year, and seems like he built a pretty good continuity with both Sellers and offensive assistant Mike Shula. It seems like there was a good thing going there. Maybe not necessarily play calling wise, but at least on field results wise for South Carolina offensively. So to see him give up the potential to coach Sellers for 2 more years, potentially coach a Heisman winning quarterback, right? If Lenoris continues to progress like some people think he will, to give that up and go to a program in App State that by no means is a slouch. Like I said, it's a really good G5 job, but has kind of had some question marks around it the past 2 years and its identity. Um, I don't know. I just think it's kind of a head scratcher for both Loggins and App State's administration. Um, it's kind of like a meh hire, in my opinion. I think they probably could have done better if they strung it out a little bit more. But who knows? Maybe Dowell goes out and proves me wrong next season.
Yeah, I mean, on the surface right now, I think App State's kind of losing its identity entirely. If the 12-team playoff was a thing the past 10 years, App State's probably in 2 of those at least.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and to me, this almost feels like a step back. It seems like they're going to have to almost rebuild under Loggins
Definitely.
versus, it was, they were putting out great coach after great coach after great coach there to the point where, I mean, App State was becoming like solid. It was like you're going to have a great coach for 2 seasons. He's going to get poached by a power
Yeah.
conference, and then it's going to be a coach right behind him for 2 years. They're going to be great, 11 wins. He's going to get poached. Then the next guy, then the next guy, and now App State's falling off that, and it's getting away from their bread and butter. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens in Boone going forward. But that Sun Belt, they continue. It continues to get better and better every season. It's not your father's old Sun Belt conference. It is actually, a decent place to play football now. So we'll,
Yeah,
we'll have to see where they stay in the standings.
I agree 100%. And I guess one last thing before we shift on to two hires out of the American. You mentioned, that window of App State coaches staying for, 2 to 3 seasons, finding that success and then moving on. Kind of an interesting data point about Loggins. He's never, at least in college, stayed at a job more than 2 seasons. So this isn't exactly a guy who's focused on continuity and program building, um, which is slightly concerning if you're App and you're trying to shift your identity and reinvent yourself a little bit.
Wow, that's a incredible stat. It's very very interesting.
All right, so we'll shift over to the American and we'll stay in the state of North Carolina. So I know that ECU did promote their interim head coach to the full time position. Um, but I figured we'd kind of talk about hires that came from outside of the program instead of focusing on internal promotion. So, ECU fans, if you're listening to this, no, we did not slide over you or ignore you. We know that you made that move, but we're trying to focus on new hires and new people coming to new programs. So, with that being said, Charlotte made pretty big splash for Charlotte football standards. Well, yesterday afternoon when they hired Tim Alpin away from Ohio. So Albin literally just had finished coaching the MAC title game, led the Bobcats to their first MAC title in I think it's like 63 or 64 years, something crazy like that. It's like 1968. So I don't know, 50 something years, I guess. Um, But he leads them to that great accomplishment, 2 10-win seasons, or sorry, 3 straight 10-win seasons for Ohio. And then he jumped ship for a pretty floundering Charlotte program that had struggled tremendously under Biff Poggi.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great example of Charlotte is getting very serious about their athletics. They made the jump. They were, paying the price on getting the new football stadium,
Mm-hmm.
wanted to join the American Conference. Now they go out and get, a proven winning coach at about the right level that they're at. Um, you know, I think Charlotte, that's a great area for sports. I think that with them investing as heavily as they are, you know, give them 3-4 years, and this could be quite a challenging Charlotte team to play against. I mean, if you're a power school and you're scheduling Charlotte past couple years, you're like, all right, cool, great win. We'll cut them a check for $1 million, and we'll see them again in 5 years. Now this could be a whole different situation. You could have a very challenging Charlotte team, similar to the ECUs of the 2000s to 2010s. Shane Carden, those years. That Charlotte could be filling that void, and who knows what App State does under Dowell Loggins.
Yeah.
Charlotte could be testing right there at the very top of the state.
Yeah, and I mean, Charlotte's a growing city. It's a beautiful campus if you've ever been to the Charlotte campus. And like you said, they're starting to get really, really serious about their athletics programs now that they've made the move from for football, FCS to CUSA. Well, I guess they were an independent for like 1 year, then to the American, and for basketball from the A10 back to Conference USA, now to the American. So I think it'll be interesting to see how it plays out for Charlotte and for Tim Albin. Um, I think this is a great hire for them in terms of how high quality of a coach they were able to poach and able to get. And who knows, maybe Charlotte starts making some noise in the American, and I wouldn't say 1 or 2 years down the line, but maybe 3, 4, 5 years down the line, maybe they're knocking on that door like Memphis, Tulane, and Army have been this year.
Absolutely. Yeah, this so far, this has been a great great postseason for coaching hires to new jobs. This is very exciting, especially for the group schools, it appears.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think we've got one more group school to talk about, but I think switching gears a little bit, if West Virginia goes out and makes a splash, that could make things in the Big 12 exciting with two new head coaches coming in. And who knows what North Carolina is going to do. I know they interviewed Bill Belichick, but I don't know how that would work out in the long run.
Yeah,
So,
North Carolina is very, very confusing in that regard.
oh yeah. So finishing up our coaching moves are the ones that we're going to look at today. We got Temple making, I guess, a pretty good splash in terms of their hire. So they fired their coach, Stan Drayton, understandably so. Temple football has not been in a good place for a while now. And they went out and got a guy in Casey Keeler from Sam Houston, who is definitely a proven winner. He oversaw Sam Houston the last few years they were in FCS. He helped them navigate the transition to FBS, and in year two of the FBS experience for Sam Houston State, they won 9 games this year and only missed out on the Conference USA Championship game because of the way tiebreakers fell. So I think this is a really good hire. He's coached in the area before. I want to say he was at Delaware for like 10 or 11 years in the early to mid 2000s. Um, who knows if Temple football is going to truly, quote unquote, succeed like we saw with Matt Rule for a few years there in the mid 2010s before he went to Baylor. But at least you're trying, and you can show your fan base that you are getting a guy who's a winner, who knows the area, and hopefully can sort of invigorate that fan base and get some nice recruits to come to Temple.
Yeah, and man, what a story that's really flown under the radar with everything else going on in college football. Sam Houston, you know, just about as successful as a jump as you can make.
Hmm.
But of course, when you have other programs with similar timelines of jumps, like James Madison, a few years ago, you had Georgia Southern and App State coming up at the same time, competing for conference championships. But Sam Houston, it's not an easy jump to make. I mean, Kennesaw State showed that, and Sam Houston has looked good, and it only seems like if they can make the right hire, they're just going to keep going with how that conference is set up. So, very good. I wouldn't say Cinderella story, but in that ballpark.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
And one note I want to make: this isn't a hire per se, at least in the head coaching position. But with Gus Malzahn now going over to Florida State, hired as the OC, what does that mean? What are we going to have a little bit of a head coaching issue next year if Florida State starts off kind of rough again? Are we hiring the next coach just not into the position yet? What kind of moves do you think Florida State's making right there?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what FSU is doing with that one. We haven't seen Malzahn be an OC in a long, long time. So maybe it's a situation where FSU is trying to appease its fans and say, look, we know you're upset. We had this great year last year that ended, unfortunately for us. We never really bounced back from that. Like we said on last week's pod, they were probably the second worst team in the Power Five outside of Purdue. Purdue went 1-11. FSU went 2-10, and one of those wins was over Charleston Southern. So they only had one win at the FBS level. Maybe this is kind of putting a little heat on Mike Norvell. Obviously, having a 2-10 season does that, but going out and getting a guy who's been a head coach and a head coach at two pretty big programs, including one in your own state, that's an interesting statement to make by the Florida State athletic department. Maybe if Norvell starts off poorly and the offense looks good, Malzahn shifts into an interim role, but they still owe Norvell a lot of money, and I think that's going to be a hang up for Florida State moving forward here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Malzahn stepped down from UCF, not fired, so did not get the buyout there. So almost wonder if there was kind of an agreement of, hey, this could be a head coach in waiting sort of situation because Norvell, outside of the one really good year where they just missed out on the playoffs with the undefeated regular season, they haven't necessarily looked amazing under him, over the span of his tenure there. So just could be interesting. Could be looking for a quick switch if things don't go well next season, or not. You never know what's going on with Florida State. Florida
Yeah.
State has been interesting since Bobby Bowden has retired. So never know what's going on there. Can only speculate. Which I guess that's just college football in general. So, Pat, I think last segment we want to go over today. Let's go over some winners and losers of the regular season and conference championship week. First, let's start with the losers. We'll end on a positive note.
All right.
Um,
That sounds good. That sounds good.
yeah,
Um,
go. Let's go with yours. What do we have over there?
all right. I'd say I'm not going to throw Bama into the losers. I'm not going to do that because they still had a nice season transitioning from Saban to Kalen DeBoer, and yes, they missed out on the playoff, but like we've talked about, I think SMU was the more deserving team, so I'm not going to throw them in the loser category. Just wanted to preface things by saying that. I think my biggest loser is the team we just talked about, Florida State. They came into this season with pretty lofty expectations, being a preseason top 10 team, having DJ Uyagalele as their quarterback. Obviously, that experiment failed miserably, but going from a team that was 13-0 and ACC champions to 2-10 is absolutely horrible. You've seen that in their recruiting. We kind of touched on that a little bit last week. They have a decent class. I'm not going to say it's like a horrible recruiting class, but lots and lots of high school commits flipped their commitments after this season. So
Mhm.
it's not like you've got these top tier prospects coming in to immediately switch things. You're going to have to do some work in NIL if you want to move the needle and get back to that competitive level. Another team I've got down as a loser is Oklahoma State. Um, they came into this season as one of the favorites to win the Big 12. They were in the Big 12 championship last year. Mike Gundy has built a reputation of success at Oklahoma State, but this year was just a complete and total disaster. They didn't win a single conference game. Ollie Gordon looked like a shell of himself. Their seventh year quarterback was really, really inconsistent and, didn't really show signs of growth. Although he is a seventh year quarterback for a reason. So maybe we should have seen that coming. And who knows? Mike Gundy might not even have a job. I don't know if you've seen the reports that have come out that say that Oklahoma State wants him to restructure his contract to free up some more money for NIL. And they're saying if he doesn't agree to the restructure, they might fire him and start looking for a new coach there. So kind of
No
crazy.
one's safe. No one's safe from NIL.
Yeah, no, it's nuts the landscape that we are currently in with college football, where a guy who's kind of a bit of an icon at an institution and has built a culture of winning and a culture of success can have one bad year and possibly lose his job. It's pretty nuts.
I don't think his press conferences help his case at all. But yeah, I absolutely understand what you're saying.
Yeah, no, we'll leave that stuff out. He's definitely an interesting character, but on the football
Those are
field,
easy enough to find.
yeah, yeah. I'll just do one last team for, I guess, a loser or disappointing team this year. And I'll say Wisconsin. When Luke Fickell was hired from Cincinnati, I guess that was 2 years ago at this point. There were a lot of high expectations surrounding him and his ability to transform and sort of reinvigorate a struggling Wisconsin program. And they did make a bowl game in his first year, but this year kind of took a little bit of a step back. Tyler Van Dyke was supposed to be their starting quarterback. They got him out of the portal from Miami. He gets hurt. He misses the rest of the year. I understand that impacts things, but they still went 5-7. Missing a bowl at Wisconsin is not really acceptable, in my opinion, especially when you've had that pedigree of success for such a long time. I mean, Wisconsin pretty much ran the Big Ten West until 4 or 5 years ago.
Mhm.
Them and Iowa would go back and forth every single year, and to see them slide so much as a program, it's pretty disheartening. And I think Luke Fickle is in a little bit of a sticky situation there. And if he doesn't turn things around in the 25 season, he could find himself out of a job. And who knows, maybe Cincinnati decides to fire Satterfield after the 25 season and he goes back there. But as of right
Another Scott
now,
Frost situation.
yeah, exactly. As of right now, it's not looking great for Luke Fickle and his experiment or run in a power conference.
Yeah, 100%. So sliding into my losers real quickly, I'm 100% with you on Florida State. That was one of the first ones I put on my list here. Just disappointing all the way across the board. Not a whole lot to say that we haven't already said, and the 2 hours that we've done the podcast these couple of weeks. Um, Staying in the same state, UCF. UCF was supposed to be a dark horse contender for the Big 12, and let me tell you, the lights were off. It was such a dark horse. That was very disappointing. KJ Jefferson, as we said earlier, did not work out. Gus Malzahn has now stepped down. Florida State OC, as we have already discussed, just not not a lot of positives going into Orlando outside of kicking in that nostalgia factor with hiring Scott Frost back. Should be interesting to see what that bounce back the next 1-2 seasons is. Um, Third, at my last team on here, I have a fourth, but we'll get into that in a sec. Third and final team, Alabama. I will put them on
Mm,
this list.
okay.
Um, I think that Kalen DeBoer still inherited a great team from Nick Saban. I believe he even got a couple transfers coming from Washington as well.
Yeah.
Um, I think that you look at how that team started and you look at the losses that they had at the end of the season at Oklahoma, who ended up not being very good. Vanderbilt, who was, decent for Vanderbilt, but let's, keep in mind as a 6-6 team, you haven't lost to that team hardly ever in your history. Um, and it's not like Vandy's in the playoff. They just barely made a bowl game. Um, and you have, one of the most dominant first halves in a game, like at the start of the season against Georgia. That's
Hmm.
that's what they should have been almost the entire year. And it was from that halftime that everything just fell apart. I mean, the brakes just gave out. Um, so I will put Bama on there. I think Bama should have been in the playoff. I don't know if they necessarily should have won the SEC because once you get in that game, anything can happen.
Yeah.
But I think they should have been hosting a playoff game for sure. And you know that's a miss being outside of this playoff. Um, And speaking of playoff, that kind of brings me into my fourth point. Losers are good non-conference games.
Yeah.
There's no point in having them anymore. The committee has kind of made the decision that you know if you're in a decent conference and you win most of your games, you're in. And anything that you build your schedule around non-conference wise is just extra. What do you call it? Extra issue, for lack of a better word. Um, that just makes your life harder. If you're a team that's already playing in the SEC, in the Big Ten, and you're scheduling like a power rival already, there's no point in you going out and finding
Mm,
another power team to go play. If you're South Carolina and Clemson, they play each other every year. Georgia Tech, even getting into Louisville, Kentucky,
yeah.
there's no point for those teams to then go out and try and find a Texas Tech, a
Hmm.
Arizona. There's no point in having that extra, marquee game. I think we're going to no longer see those like Southern Cal versus LSU games to start the season, because there's no point there, because the whole schedule matters now. They've made that point, clear at least, which is good. I think that's a good thing. But I think it really hurts, those good season opener slash like end of the season matchups.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree with you there. I do think, unfortunately, we're going to see, I guess you could say, a slide back or a decrease in the amount of high quality P4 on P4 non-conf matchups that we see moving forward and into the future. But I think one thing that a lot of people are, I guess you could say, like missing when it comes to this conversation and saying, okay, well, non-conference shouldn't matter. I've seen people on Twitter who are South Carolina fans saying that we should, or they should, end the rivalry with Clemson because they only moved up 2 spots in the playoff rankings after beating Clemson. I think that's a little bit much. If you look at a team, we'll just look at SMU versus Alabama in terms of non-conference. SMU played TCU, which that rivalry is now dead. But this was the last year they played TCU. They played BYU in the non-conference. Both of those teams are better than anybody Alabama played in the non-conference. Alabama played USF, Mercer, Western Kentucky, and that Wisconsin team that I mentioned as one of the more disappointing teams this year. So it's not like Alabama was going up against world beaters and then SMU was playing nobodies, right? I think it does still matter to have a good profile, but like you said, I think teams are going to prioritize matchups where they can win rather than matchups that, I guess, draw eyeballs and draw ratings, right? You're always going to have those bigger games because the TV networks are going to want them. But I think we're going to see them with less and less frequency because of, we'll say, the approaches and the perspectives that people have taken after the committee's rankings this year.
For sure. And I think it has to do a lot of, the timing of the polls, but, that South Carolina team that beat Clemson, they moved up, very, very slightly, especially compared to what, the hype was being built up around, you win that game, you're in. The week before, they play a Wofford team who in FCS was, dancing around 500. They moved up more after that game than after the
Yeah,
Clemson game. So,
yeah.
you know, it also has to do a little bit with timing. So, let's hop into winners here at the end, and staying with that South Carolina team. They're my number one winner. This team was, you know a fringe 500 team going into the season. Looking at that schedule, you're like, hopefully they get 6 wins. They get 9. Shane Beamer puts himself up there with Coach Sig as potential Coach of the Year.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, can't say much more. Going into the season, you hoped for a bowl game. You almost got the playoff. That's a win for South Carolina fans.
Huge
Uh,
win.
then Coach Sig, Indiana, another winner right there. And he got them in the playoff. Indiana came from perennial 4-8 power to they're in the playoff now. And we never think about Indiana in this regard. And Coach Sig got them going quick. It'll be exciting to see what they do in this playoff and then the next couple seasons. Bloomington could be the place to be for college football.
Yeah, I mean, both of those are great options. I'm glad I picked some smaller teams to have on my winners list because both of those teams are on my list, and I don't want to beat a dead horse. But like you said, Indiana going from a 3-9, 4-8, 5-7 kind of cycle to 11-1 is probably the best story we have in college football this year. And I think as fans, yes, Indiana didn't play as strong of a schedule as Michigan or Washington or USC, right? Some of these mid-level Big Ten teams, but they beat almost everyone they played. And I think we just need to take a minute to appreciate that and appreciate how special an 11-1 Indiana football team really is.
100%.
You got any more winners, or you want me to jump into mine?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and knock out my winners. I had a little bit. I was feeling positive when making this list. I have a couple more. Now with the head coach being hired away, we'll see what they turn into. But for this season, nonetheless, UNLV. UNLV had quite an interesting start of the season. Losing your starting quarterback to NIL may or may not have been paid. Then you go into your backup. Uh, but I mean, really, the story of that team, as good as the offense was to start the year, defense. Barry Odom really put his signature on that entire program, and I mean that is what Purdue's hoping that they become, just a Big Ten version of that with hiring him. But I mean, I think UNLV, they gave Boise State a really good game during the regular season, not as much in the conference championship game, but still making
Hmm.
it to that point. I didn't personally have UNLV making it to this stage of the season. I thought they'd be a bowl team. Not, hell, you win your conference championship, you're in the playoff.
Yeah.
They were right there. 4 quarters is all that separated them. So UNLV, great story. Another group school, Army, which I mean, we've already talked to them about them a good bit. If they play a little bit closer to Notre Dame, are they in? If they beat them, they're 100% in. Just a great story. Seeing the Navy and Army be very good this year, that'll be a fun game to watch next weekend. Jeff Monken, you know, he's been consistent. It's been a slow consistent, but he's been consistent at Army, and you know, he's got him playing good football right now. And then my final team is I feel like this is a bit under the radar, so much so that I don't even have very many notes other than I was impressed to see where they finished their season. Illinois
Hmm.
did not have this. They have a Citrus Bowl matchup with another winner, South Carolina. Um, you know, didn't really have Illinois doing much of anything this year, so much so that I hardly watched them. And next thing you know, they're one of the better teams in the Big Ten. So unfortunately, I don't have very many notes on them, but I want to give them a shout out because they ended up having a pretty good season.
Yeah, no, Illinois was a really awesome story this year. Brett Bielema did a really nice job turning this program around in the few years that he's been there. And I think they got pretty decent quarterback play this year from Luke Altmaier, and that helped them kind of navigate a few dicey results. But 9-3 is 9-3. I agree that Illinois is a huge winner this year in the way that they're moving their program forward.
Very
So,
nice. Yeah.
kind of jumping into my winners, like I said, I won't harp on the ones you already mentioned, like South Carolina, Indiana, Illinois. Um, my first winner actually is a G5 school, and I wrote this right after the MAC championship, so maybe they're not as big of a winner anymore. But I had Ohio on there. 3 straight 10-win seasons is a great accomplishment. Tim Albin kind of picking right up where things were left under his mentor and his predecessor. And building Ohio into a really solid MAC team and a really solid G5 program. Now, I guess you could shift them into sort of a fringe category since Tim Albin's no longer there. But I think it's a great story for Ohio. First MAC championship since 1968. That's something to celebrate. And I want to keep them in my winners list because of that. Moving on, I've got SMU in there. SMU had a great regular season, went 11-1. Unfortunately, yes, they did lose to Clemson last night, and a bit of a heartbreaker on a absolute bomb of a field goal, 56 yards from the Clemson kicker, which is pretty impressive. But they went 11-2. This is a team that paid its way into the ACC. That's how bad they wanted to be in a Power Four conference, getting out of Conference USA and putting themselves into a position where they could make the playoff. And it worked out. It paid off. Rhett Lashley did a great job coaching this team up. It was a little kind of confusing at the beginning of the year when they were running that two quarterback system. But once Kevin Jennings took over and was the clear starter, I think their offense just clicked a lot better, flowed a lot smoother, and they played some great football down the stretch. So I would definitely want to shout out SMU on an amazing season, almost winning the ACC in their first year in the conference and making the college football playoff this year as a, we'll say, non-traditional power. And then the last team I'll give a shout out to is another conference champion, and one that I don't think a whole lot of people envisioned being in this scenario in Arizona State. Um, Hand up, I'll admit I was wrong when I was wrong. I was really high on Iowa State. I thought they were going to win that game yesterday. They definitely did not. um, Arizona State is a really good football team, a really well coached football team by Kenny Dillingham. And I think it's clear that Dillingham wants to be there, wants to succeed there, and wants to build Arizona State football back to kind of what it was in the late 90s, where they were having pretty good success in um, sort of the beginnings of the Pac 10, RIP. And it's good to see them back on the national stage. The Sun Devils are a really interesting team. And like we talked about in our playoff preview, they're really hot right now. You said you don't want to see them if you're a different team, and I agree with you, right? They're a scary offense, and I'm excited for not just what this year holds for them, but what the future holds as Coach Dillingham can kind of get more of his guys in there. This is only year two that he's in charge. So to see that kind of shift and that kind of turnaround after the disaster that was the Herm Edwards era is really awesome to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are two great picks to round up this podcast. The SMU, we don't know what they're going to have going into next season. I think they're a little bit more of a question mark. But Arizona State, I think that they could be built to run the beginning of this new age Big 12 that we have now. I really didn't like them at the beginning of the season, and I remember they played that Kansas game, and Kansas had already kind of shown that they weren't going to be very good this year. But I felt like Arizona State, it was a close game. Whatever Kansas had left from their dark horse hype, Arizona State just took all of it right then, and then just went on this run. And they have not looked back.
Yeah, it's been really amazing. And to see the way this Arizona State team has progressed through the year is kind of crazy. They were in a dogfight with Texas State in Texas at the beginning of the year. And then they go from that to winning the Big 12 championship by 26 points, and just throttling Iowa State. It's just a really great story. And like you said, just kind of goes to show the stability and the upward trajectory that Dillingham has brought to this program.
100%. 100%. And I think as we wrap up, we have two games, I believe. We have Army Navy, and then what did you say the other game was?
The other game is the Salute to Veterans Bowl, and it is South Alabama against Western Michigan.
Okay. Any quick predictions there?
I'm going to be honest. I have not watched a lot of South Alabama or Western Michigan. I know South Alabama, he might be in the portal before the game happens, but they have a really solid running back in Fluff Bothwell, probably the best G5 back out there. I think he'll find himself on a P4 team next year. So if I had to guess, if Fluff is playing, give me South Alabama. And like you said earlier, I don't see this being a year where Navy can kind of derail Army's season a little bit. I think the Black Knights handle business there against their biggest rival and roll into bowl season at 12-1.
Yeah, 100%. I am with you there. I think even if Fluff's not playing, I think I like the Jaguars in that matchup. Just a little bit more challenges in that Sun Belt conference, so a little bit more tests for them to go into the bowl season with than the MAC. And yeah, I unfortunately, as much as I don't like to say it because I normally support Navy, I think this is an Army year. So I think they are going to sing second. So that's all for this week. We're going to go over all of our bowl season matchup projections for the actual bowls next week, and then react to any more coaching carousel and the matchups that happen next weekend. So until next time, I'm TJ, and that's Pat over there.
Yes, sir.
We will see y'all next week.